The night shift at the small regional office was usually uneventful. Fluorescent lights hummed softly above the rows of desks, and outside the windows the city had already settled into a calm silence. Special Agent Mark Mercer leaned back in his chair and slowly sipped lukewarm coffee. Across from him, Special Agent Elena Ruiz was reviewing old case files, turning each page with careful patience. "Quiet night," Mark said softly. Elena smiled without looking up. "You just guaranteed it won't stay that way." For a moment, nothing happened. Only the quiet tapping of Elena's keyboard and the low buzz of the lights filled the room. Then the phone rang, not loudly. Just a simple, steady ring that somehow sounded slightly out of place in the late-night calm. Mark reached over and picked it up. "Mercer." There was a pause on the other end, then a slow, uncertain voice spoke. Yes. I'm calling from a ranger station near Blackwood National Forest." Mark sat up a little straighter. "What seems to be the issue?" "Well, that's the thing. I'm not exactly sure." Elena glanced up now, curious. The ranger continued. "For the past 3 nights, the station radio has been picking up something." "What kind of something?" Mark asked. "Voices," the ranger replied quietly. Elena closed the file she had been reading. "Voices from where?" Mark asked. "That's the strange part," the ranger said. "They sound like old recordings. Like someone speaking through a very old microphone." Mark scribbled a few notes. "Is this interfering with emergency channels?" "No, not exactly. It only happens around 2:17 a.m. every night." Elena raised an eyebrow. "That's oddly specific," she murmured. Mark nodded. "What are the voices saying?" he asked. The ranger hesitated. "They sound like 2 people having a conversation." "About what?" Another pause. "Well," the ranger said slowly, "that's the unsettling part." Mark waited. "They're talking about a missing person case." Elena leaned forward. "What case?" Mark asked. "I'm not sure," the ranger replied. "But it sounds official. Like investigators talking." Mark looked over at Elena. She whispered, "Ask the date." Mark nodded. "What date do the voices mention?" The ranger took a breath. "They say October 14, 1987. Elena frowned. Mark flipped through a nearby notebook. "Why is that strange?" he asked. "Because," the ranger said quietly, "the ranger station wasn't built until 1996. The line went silent for a moment. Mark slowly wrote down the final note. "Transmission appears every night at 2:17 a.m. Elena folded her arms. "Ghost radio?" she joked gently. Mark shook his head. "Probably old equipment interference." But even as he said it, something about the situation felt unusual, not alarming, just unusual. Mark picked up the phone again. "We'll come take a look tomorrow," he said calmly. "Thank you," the ranger replied with relief. The call ended. The office returned to its quiet hum. Elena stretched and stood. "So," she said with a small smile, "road trip?" Mark grabbed his coat. "Looks like it." Outside, the night air was cool and still. Neither of them knew it yet, but the quiet call from the ranger station would soon become one of the strangest cases they had ever encountered. And strangely enough, one of the calmest. Morning arrived slowly over the city, wrapped in a pale gray sky and a light mist that drifted between the buildings. The kind of morning that felt quiet even before the day had fully begun. Special Agent Mark Mercer guided the government sedan onto the highway while Elena Ruiz adjusted the radio volume to a soft background hum. Neither of them were in a hurry. The drive to Blackwood National Forest would take several hours, and the steady rhythm of the road seemed to encourage calm conversation. Elena held a small notebook in her lap. October 14, 1987, she said thoughtfully. Does that date ring any bells? Mark kept his eyes on the road. Not immediately. But the 80s had plenty of unsolved cases. Elena nodded slowly. That ranger sounded genuinely confused, she said. Not scared. Just puzzled. Mark smiled faintly. That's usually when things turn out to be something simple. They passed long stretches of countryside where the landscape became quieter with every mile. Buildings slowly disappeared, replaced by wide fields and eventually thick forests that stretched along the hills. A soft wind moved through the trees, bending their branches gently as if the forest itself was breathing slowly. Elena flipped through a small printed archive report she had downloaded earlier that morning. Here's something interesting, she said. Mark glanced over briefly. What did you find? There was a missing persons case filed on October 14, 1987. A park ranger named Thomas Halpern. Mark raised an eyebrow. From Blackwood? Elena nodded. Exactly. For a few moments, the only sound in the car was the quiet hum of the tires against the asphalt. That might explain the radio voices, Mark said eventually. Maybe old recordings from the investigation. But why would they suddenly start broadcasting now? Elena asked. Mark shrugged slightly. Old equipment sometimes behaves in strange ways. Elena looked out the window as the road curved deeper into the forest. Tall pine trees lined both sides of the road now, their branches forming long shadows across the pavement. The deeper they drove, the quieter everything seemed to become. Even the air looked calmer here. After another 30 minutes, a wooden sign appeared beside the road. Blackwood National Forest, Ranger Station 4 miles, Elena smiled. Looks like we're close. Mark slowed the car slightly as the road narrowed. So far, he said, this is the calmest unusual incident we've had all year. Elena laughed softly. Let's not say that too early. The forest road eventually opened into a small clearing. A modest wooden ranger station stood there. Surrounded by tall trees and a small radio tower rising quietly beside the building, a man in a green ranger uniform was waiting outside when their car rolled to a stop. He looked relieved when they stepped out. You must be the agents, he said. Mark shook his hand. Agent Mercer. This is Agent Ruiz. The ranger nodded. Elliot Grayson. Elena glanced at the radio tower. So the transmissions happen from inside the station? Elliot nodded. Every night at exactly 2:17 a.m., Mark looked up at the quiet tower, its antenna barely moving in the wind. And always the same voices? Yes, Elliot said. He paused for a moment. It sounds like two investigators discussing the missing ranger. Elena and Mark exchanged a glance. Mark spoke calmly. And they mention October 14, 1987. Elliot nodded slowly. Every time. A gentle breeze moved through the clearing, rustling the pine trees above them. The forest remained peaceful and still, but somewhere inside the ranger station radio equipment, a conversation from nearly 40 years ago was quietly waiting to be heard again, and tonight, at 2:17 a.m., the agents planned to listen carefully, for the first time. The ranger station was smaller than Mark had expected. It looked more like a quiet cabin than a government facility. The wooden walls had aged into a soft gray color, and the porch creaked gently as the three of them stepped inside. A warm scent of pine and old paper filled the room. Inside, the station was simple. A desk, several filing cabinets, a map of the forest pinned to the wall, and in the corner, a radio console with several switches and dials. Elena walked toward the large forest map. Thin red lines marked hiking trails, while wide green sections showed the densest parts of Blackwood National Forest. "It's beautiful out here," she said quietly. Elliot smiled. "It's very peaceful most of the time." Mark moved closer to the radio console. The equipment looked older than the rest of the station, though it had clearly been maintained with care. "When did the voices start?" he asked. "4 nights ago," Elliot replied. "At first I thought someone was using an old frequency." Mark turned one of the small knobs gently, though the radio remained silent. "And you're sure it always starts at the same time?" Elliot nodded. "Exactly 2:17 a.m. The first time it happened, it lasted about 3 minutes." Elena looked over from the map. "What were they saying?" Elliot thought for a moment. "They sounded like investigators reviewing the missing ranger case." Mark leaned back slightly. "Did you record it?" Elliot shook his head. "I was too confused the first night. The second night I tried to record it with my phone, but the audio didn't capture anything." Elena frowned. "You mean the phone picked up silence?" "Exactly," Elliot said. Mark exchanged a glance with Elena. "That's interesting." Outside the station windows, the forest looked calm and still. Sunlight filtered softly through the tall trees, and a distant bird called somewhere deeper in the woods. Nothing about the place felt unusual. If anything, it felt unusually peaceful. Elena walked over to a shelf and began looking through several old binders. "These are ranger logs?" she asked. "Yes," Elliot said. "They go back about 30 years. Elena carefully pulled out one of the oldest binders and placed it on the table. Dust rose slightly as she opened it. Mark walked over beside her. "What year is that?" Elena checked the faded label. 1996, the year the station was built. She slowly turned the pages. Each entry was neat and short: weather reports, trail inspections, wildlife sightings. Everything about the logbook felt routine. Then Elena stopped turning the pages. She tilted her head slightly. "Mark." He leaned closer. "What is it?" Elena pointed to one entry near the beginning of the book. "Look at the date." Mark read it, October 14, 1996. Below the date was a short handwritten note. Mark read it quietly. "Radio equipment installed today. During testing, we briefly received a faint transmission." He paused. Elena looked at him. "What does it say next?" Mark continued reading. Transmission sounded like two investigators discussing the disappearance of Ranger Thomas Halpern. The room became very quiet. Elliot looked confused. "That's impossible," he said slowly. Mark looked up. "Why?" Elliot folded his arms. "Because that's exactly what the voices are saying now." A soft breeze moved through the trees outside. For a moment, the station felt completely still. Elena gently closed the binder. "So this has happened before," she said quietly. Mark nodded. 30 years ago. He looked over at the silent radio console. Tonight, at 2:17 a.m., they would finally hear the strange transmission for themselves, and perhaps discover why a conversation from the past kept returning to this quiet ranger station in the forest. The afternoon passed quietly at the ranger station. Sunlight filtered gently through the tall pine trees, casting long golden beams across the clearing. Occasionally a bird landed on the radio tower and then flew away again, disappearing into the forest. Inside the station, the atmosphere remained calm. Mark sat at the small desk reviewing the old ranger logs while Elena carefully examined the radio console. Elliot moved around the station preparing coffee and occasionally glancing at the large clock on the wall. No one seemed nervous, just curious. "Still think it's interference?" Elena asked casually while adjusting one of the radio dials. Mark leaned back in the wooden chair. "Most unusual things turn out to have simple explanations," he said. Elena smiled slightly. "That's a very calm way of saying you have no idea what this is." Mark chuckled quietly. "Fair point." Elliot placed 3 cups of coffee on the table. "I've worked in forests for 12 years, he said. "You'd be surprised how often equipment does strange things out here." Elena took a sip. "Electromagnetic interference?" "Sometimes," Elliot replied. "Sometimes just old wiring." Mark closed the logbook and looked toward the radio. "But the timing is unusual," he said. "Exactly 2:17 every night." The wall clock ticked steadily above them. It was only 8:42 p.m., plenty of time remained. Outside, evening slowly arrived in the forest. The sunlight faded into softer shades of orange and purple while the temperature cooled slightly. By 10:00 p.m., the forest had become very quiet. By 11:30 p.m., even the wind had settled. Inside the station, the lights were dimmed slightly to make the radio console easier to monitor. Elena connected a small digital recorder to the equipment. "If the voices appear tonight," she said, "this should capture them." Elliot nodded. "I hope it works better than my phone." Midnight arrived quietly. The clock continued its steady ticking. 12:45 a.m. 1:10 a.m. The 3 of them spoke less now. Not because of tension, but because the quiet of the forest seemed to encourage silence. At 1:55 a.m., Mark stood and stretched. 22 minutes, he said. Elena looked at the recorder display. "Everything's ready." Elliot sat in the chair closest to the radio console, watching the equipment carefully. Outside the station windows, the forest looked dark but peaceful. The tall trees stood motionless under the faint moonlight. Then the clock reached 2:16 a.m. The room grew even quieter. No one spoke. Only the soft ticking of the clock could be heard. Then, 2:17 a.m., at first. Nothing happened. The radio console remained silent. Elena frowned slightly. "Maybe tonight," Suddenly a faint crackle came from the speaker. All three of them turned toward the radio. The sound was soft, almost like distant static drifting through the air. Then the static slowly cleared, and a voice appeared, old, calm, slightly distorted. Case file October 14, 1987. Elena's eyes widened. Mark leaned closer to the speaker. Another voice responded. Yes. Ranger Halpern disappearance. The audio sounded exactly like Elliot had described, two investigators speaking quietly, discussing the case. But the tone of the recording felt strangely peaceful, not urgent, not dramatic, just two people calmly reviewing details. Elliot whispered softly. That's them. The first voice spoke again. Search teams covered the North Ridge Trail. The second voice replied. No sign of Halpern. Elena quickly checked the recorder. The display was moving. It was recording. Mark listened carefully to every word. Something about the voices felt oddly familiar, not frightening, just distant, like listening to an old conversation echoing through time. Then the first voice said something that made Mark slowly straighten in his chair. Agent Mercer, what do you think? Mark froze. Elena looked at him. The voice on the radio continued. Agent Ruiz believes the Ranger may have discovered something unusual. The room became completely still. Elena whispered slowly. Mark. Mark didn't respond, because the two voices on the radio were now calmly discussing the case, using their names. For several seconds, no one in the ranger station spoke. The soft crackle of the radio filled the room as the two distant voices continued their calm conversation. Elena slowly turned toward Mark. Did they just say our names? Mark didn't answer immediately. He leaned closer to the speaker, listening carefully. The first voice spoke again. Agent Mercer believes the search area should expand east of the river. The second voice replied. Agent Ruiz suggested reviewing older ranger reports first. Elena's eyes widened slightly. That's exactly what we did today, she whispered. Elliot looked back and forth between them. You mean? The voices are describing what you've been doing. Mark nodded slowly, but something else had caught his attention. The voice that said his name sounded strangely familiar, not identical, but close, almost like. He didn't finish the thought. Instead, he reached over and gently turned the volume up a little. The audio remained soft and slightly distorted, like a recording played through old equipment. The first voice continued calmly. If Halpern discovered something in the forest, it may explain his disappearance. The second voice answered. Agreed. The old northern observation tower should be checked. Elena looked at the large forest map on the wall. There's an observation tower marked here, she said quietly. Elliot walked over and studied the map. That tower was abandoned years ago. Mark glanced at the radio again. The voices kept speaking with the same calm tone. No panic, no urgency, just quiet investigators discussing a case. Then the second voice said something unexpected. We should leave a note in the ranger log. Mark slowly turned toward the table. The old binder from earlier still rested there. Elena looked at it too. Mark. He walked over and opened the binder again. The pages rustled softly as he flipped through them. October 14, 1996. The same page they had found earlier, but now Mark noticed something new. Below the first handwritten note was another line, one they were certain hadn't been there before. Elena leaned closer. What does it say? Mark read it slowly. Agents Mercer and Ruiz will likely arrive many years later. Elliot stared. That wasn't there earlier. Mark continued reading. The radio transmission will guide them to the northern observation tower. Elena felt a small chill run through her arms. But who wrote that? Mark looked at the handwriting. It was neat, calm, careful. Then he turned back toward the radio. At that exact moment, the first voice spoke again. Agent Mercer. Mark froze. The voice sounded clearer now, closer. By the time you hear this, the voice continued, you will already be wondering how this recording exists. Elena slowly walked toward the radio. The second voice spoke next. Don't worry. Nothing dangerous is happening. There was a gentle pause, then the first voice said something that made the entire room go quiet again. Because, Mark. The voice sounded almost identical to his own. You're the one who recorded this. Outside, the forest remained calm and silent under the moonlight. Inside the ranger station, the radio continued its strange broadcast, a conversation from the future. Guiding them somewhere deep in the quiet woods of Blackwood, toward the old northern observation tower. For a while, none of them moved. The quiet voice from the radio faded slowly back into soft static, as if the conversation had gently reached its end. Mark stared at the speaker. Did it say anything else before? He asked Elliot. Elliot shook his head. No. That's about how it always ends. Elena glanced at the digital recorder. The timer showed the transmission had lasted just over 3 minutes. She pressed stop and replayed the audio. The same calm voices filled the room again, Agents Mercer and Ruiz, the northern observation tower, the note in the ranger log, and finally, the strange statement. You're the one who recorded this. Elena turned the recorder off. Well, she said softly, whoever made that recording clearly wanted us to go somewhere. Mark nodded. The observation tower. Elliot crossed his arms thoughtfully. That trail hasn't been used in years. It's still accessible, but the tower itself was closed after a storm damaged part of it. Mark walked over to the map. The tower stood several miles north of the station, deep in a thick section of forest. How long would it take to get there? He asked. About 40 minutes by vehicle, Elliot said. Then another 10 minutes on foot. Elena looked at the clock. It was 2:32 a.m. Mark considered this for a moment. Then he smiled slightly. Well, he said calmly, it's not like we're busy tonight. Elliot chuckled. I was hoping you'd say that. Within a few minutes they were outside again. The forest felt cooler now, wrapped in the calm stillness of early morning. A thin mist drifted between the tall trees, glowing faintly in the moonlight. Mark started the car while Elena sat in the passenger seat reviewing the recorder again through headphones. Behind them, Elliot followed in a small ranger truck. The narrow forest road curved gently through the dark woods. Headlights moved slowly across tree trunks and quiet branches. No animals crossed their path. No strange sounds came from the forest. Everything felt peaceful. After about 35 minutes, the road narrowed further and eventually ended in a small clearing. Elliot parked beside them. This is as far as vehicles go, he said. Mark stepped out of the car and stretched slightly. The air smelled strongly of pine and cool earth. Elena shined a flashlight down the trail. The path was old but still visible, winding quietly between tall trees. Observation Tower should be about 10 minutes up that trail, Elliot said. They began walking. The forest was silent except for the soft crunch of gravel beneath their shoes. Their flashlights illuminated pieces of the path ahead, occasionally catching the reflective glow of old trail markers on the trees. After several minutes, the shape of something tall appeared through the mist, a wooden structure rising above the trees, the Northern Observation Tower. It looked old but sturdy. The narrow staircase wrapped around the outside, leading up to a small enclosed platform at the top. Elena tilted her flashlight upward. Still standing, she said, Mark walked slowly toward the base of the tower. The wooden beams creaked gently in the night breeze. Attached to one of the support posts was a small metal box. Elliot looked surprised. "I've never noticed that before." Mark opened it carefully. Inside was a sealed envelope. On the front were 3 neatly written names: Agent Mercer, Agent Ruiz, Ranger Grayson. Elena exhaled softly. "Well," she said, "whoever left this expected us." Mark opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The handwriting looked familiar, very familiar. Mark read it quietly. Then he smiled. Elena raised an eyebrow. "What does it say?" Mark handed her the note. At the top of the page were the words, "Don't worry. Everything is going exactly as planned." And below that, a date, October 14, 1987. The forest remained quiet around the tower. A soft wind moved through the tall pines, making the upper branches whisper gently above them. Elena read the note again under the beam of her flashlight. October 14, 1987. She said slowly. "That's the same date mentioned in the radio transmission." Mark nodded. "And the date of the Ranger's disappearance." Elliot looked at the paper carefully. "But how could someone in 1987 know our names?" No one answered immediately. The question floated quietly in the cool night air. Elena continued reading the rest of the message. The handwriting was neat and calm, just like the note in the Ranger log. "If you are reading this, the radio transmission worked. Please don't worry. Nothing dangerous has happened. The explanation is simple, but it may take a little time to understand." Mark smiled faintly. "That sounds reassuring." Elena kept reading. "Many years ago, during an investigation in this forest, we discovered something unusual about the radio tower nearby. Under very specific atmospheric conditions, the equipment occasionally sends signals. Not just across distance, but across time." Elliot blinked. "Across time?" Elena shrugged gently. "Stranger things have happened in physics." Mark leaned against one of the wooden beams of the tower. "So someone in 1987 figured this out." Elena nodded and continued. "We were able to transmit a short conversation forward in time. Not far, only about 40 years. If everything worked correctly, you are hearing that transmission now." Mark looked back toward the dark forest trail. "So the voices we heard that were recorded in 1987, Elena finished. Elliot scratched his head. "That still doesn't explain how they knew about you too." Elena turned the page. "There's more." She read the next line slowly. "If you're confused about the voices sounding familiar, that's because they should. The recording was made with the help of 2 investigators who arrived here unexpectedly." Mark tilted his head. "Investigators who arrived unexpectedly?" Elena finished reading the final line. "Those investigators were you." The 3 of them stood silently for a moment. Elliot finally spoke. I feel like we just skipped several chapters of a story. Mark chuckled softly. That's one way to put it. Elena looked up at the observation tower staircase. So according to this, we eventually travel back to 1987, Mark said. Elliot folded his arms. And record the transmission that we already heard. Mark nodded calmly. Yes. Elliot sighed. That's a surprisingly relaxed way to react to time travel. Mark shrugged. Right now it's just a theory written on a piece of paper. Elena looked back at the note. There's one last instruction. Mark gestured for her to continue. She read the final paragraph. At sunrise, return to the ranger station and turn the radio transmitter to frequency 108.3. When the signal stabilizes, begin recording. Everything else will happen naturally. The forest around them remained peaceful. No strange lights, no mysterious sounds, just the quiet rustling of trees. Elliot looked at the sky. A faint blue glow was beginning to appear on the horizon. Sunrise is in about 40 minutes, he said. Mark nodded. Well, he said calmly, we might as well see what happens. Elena folded the note carefully and placed it back in the envelope. Agreed. They began walking back down the quiet trail toward their vehicles. Above them, the sky slowly brightened, and somewhere, perhaps many years away, two investigators were preparing to record a conversation that would travel forward through time, back to this very night in Blackwood Forest. By the time they returned to the ranger station, the first soft light of morning had begun to spread through the forest. A pale blue glow filtered between the tall pine trees, slowly replacing the darkness of night. Birds had begun their early calls, and the quiet clearing around the station felt peaceful and ordinary again. Inside, the station looked exactly as they had left it. The radio console sat quietly in the corner. The clock now read 5:48 a.m. Elliot poured 3 fresh cups of coffee while Elena placed the digital recorder back on the table beside the radio equipment. Mark unfolded the envelope again and reread the final instruction. Frequency 108.3, he said. Elena sat down in front of the console. Let's see if the mysterious instructions are accurate. She gently turned one of the dials. The radio produced a soft wave of static. Mark leaned against the desk, watching calmly. Elliot stood near the window, looking out at the slowly brightening forest. The station felt warm and quiet. Elena adjusted the dial slightly. 108.3, she said. For a moment, nothing happened, just the steady sound of static. Then the noise softened, almost like a signal slowly finding its balance. Elena tilted her head. Interesting. Mark stepped closer. What is it? The signal isn't coming from outside, she said. It's cycling through the transmitter itself. Elliot turned around. You mean it's looping internally? Elena nodded. Exactly. Mark smiled faintly. That seems promising. The static slowly faded. The signal became clear, not perfectly clear, but stable. Elena pressed the record button on the digital recorder. Recording started. The three of them waited quietly. Seconds passed, then the radio speaker made a small clicking sound, and a voice appeared, but this time, it wasn't the mysterious old recording. It was Mark's voice, clear, present, coming through the radio speaker even as he stood beside it. Elliot blinked. How are you? Mark raised a hand slightly. I didn't say anything. The voice from the radio spoke again. Testing transmission. Elena's eyes widened. That's definitely you. Mark leaned closer to the console. The strange part was not just the voice, it was the tone. It sounded calm, relaxed, like someone speaking during a routine recording. The voice continued. Agents Mercer and Ruiz present. Ranger Grayson assisting. Elena whispered slowly. That's exactly what the note described. Elliot rubbed his forehead. I feel like we're listening to a recording from a moment that hasn't happened yet. Mark nodded. That seems to be the case. The voice from the radio continued. Beginning case discussion. Ranger Thomas Halpern disappearance. Elena slowly turned toward Mark. This is the conversation. Mark nodded. The one we heard at 2:17. Outside the station windows, the sunrise continued quietly. Golden light touched the tops of the trees. Inside the station, the radio calmly played the exact conversation they had already heard during the night. Every sentence, every pause, the same calm voices discussing the case. Elena looked at the recorder. It's capturing everything. Mark listened carefully as the radio voice said the next line. Agent Mercer, what do you think? Mark smiled slightly. That's where things get interesting. Because in just a few seconds, the voice on the radio would say the sentence that had surprised them during the night, the sentence that revealed the strange truth, and now, for the first time, they were the ones creating the recording. The same recording that had already traveled nearly 40 years forward in time. Morning sunlight now filled the ranger station with a soft golden glow. The radio console quietly transmitted the strange signal while the recorder continued capturing every word. Mark sat in the chair beside the microphone. Elena sat across from him with the forest map open on the table. Elliot leaned against the wall, watching with a mixture of curiosity and quiet disbelief. Mark took a small breath. Well, he said calmly, if this is the recording we already heard, we should probably follow the script. Elena smiled. That might be the safest way to keep the timeline from getting confused. Elliot chuckled softly. I never thought my morning coffee would involve time loops. Mark leaned closer to the microphone. His voice was calm and steady. Case file October 14, 1987. The radio speaker gave a small confirmation click, as if acknowledging the transmission. Elena followed naturally. Yes. Ranger Halpern disappearance. Mark glanced at the recorder display. The time counter continued moving forward. Somewhere decades later, the same conversation had already been heard. Now they were simply recreating it. Mark continued. Search teams covered the North Ridge Trail. Elena nodded slightly and replied just as she remembered hearing it during the night. No sign of Halpern. The room felt peaceful. No tension, no rush, just a quiet recording session in a small ranger station. Outside, birds moved through the morning sky above the trees. Mark spoke again. If Halpern discovered something in the forest, it may explain his disappearance. Elena followed the next line naturally. Agreed. The old northern observation tower should be checked. Elliot shook his head slowly. That's incredible. Mark raised a finger gently. Almost at the part that surprised us. Elena smiled. The part where you ask yourself a question. Mark laughed quietly. Right. He leaned toward the microphone again. Agent Mercer, what do you think? Then Elena continued the conversation. Agent Ruiz believes the ranger may have discovered something unusual. Mark paused for a moment. He remembered exactly what came next, the line that had made the three of them freeze during the night. He spoke slowly. Agent Mercer. He leaned closer to the microphone. By the time you hear this, you will already be wondering how this recording exists. Elena followed. Don't worry. Nothing dangerous is happening. Mark smiled slightly as he delivered the final line. Because, Mark. He looked at the recorder. You're the one who recorded this. The radio console made a soft clicking sound. The signal slowly faded, the transmission had ended. Elena pressed stop on the recorder. For a few seconds, no one spoke, then Elliot laughed quietly. Well. That was probably the calmest time travel event in history. Mark leaned back in the chair. Technically we didn't travel through time. Elena closed the forest map. We just sent a message forward. Outside, the forest looked peaceful and bright in the morning light. Mark looked at the envelope on the table. There's still one mystery left. Elliot tilted his head. What's that? Mark smiled. We still haven't figured out what happened to Ranger Halpern. Elena raised an eyebrow. That's true. Elliot nodded slowly. The whole reason this investigation started. Mark stood and stretched. Well, he said calmly, we might as well finish the case. Because somewhere in the quiet forest of Blackwood, the answer to a 40-year-old disappearance was still waiting to be discovered. Evergreen Tree, and it was much closer than they expected. The ranger station felt different in the full light of morning. What had seemed mysterious during the night now looked calm and ordinary again. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating the wooden floor and the quiet radio console that had just carried a message across decades. Mark stretched his arms slightly. Well, he said, we solved the time radio puzzle. Elena smiled. Now we solve the actual case. Elliot walked to the large forest map again. The observation tower is the last place mentioned in the recording, he said. And the last location connected to Ranger Halpern. Mark nodded. Let's take another look. The three of them returned to their vehicles and drove once more through the quiet forest road. This time the woods looked completely different in daylight. Sunlight filtered through the tall pines, birds moved between branches, a gentle breeze carried the scent of pine needles and warm earth. Nothing about the forest felt mysterious now, just peaceful. When they reached the observation tower again, the mist from the night had disappeared. The tall wooden structure stood clearly against the bright sky. Mark walked slowly around the base of the tower. Elena examined the ground nearby. Elliot checked the old wooden supports. After a few minutes, Elena called out. Mark, look at this. Near the back of the tower, partially hidden beneath fallen branches, was a small wooden hatch built into the ground. Elliot knelt beside it. I've never seen this before. Mark brushed away some leaves. The hatch opened easily. Below it was a short wooden ladder leading down into a small underground storage room. Cool air drifted upward from the space. Elena shined her flashlight down. Looks like an old supply shelter. Mark climbed down first. The room below was small but dry. Shelves lined the walls, holding several dusty containers and old emergency supplies. Then Mark noticed something else, a folding chair, a small desk, and a stack of carefully organized notebooks. Elena and Elliot climbed down beside him. Mark opened the first notebook. The pages were filled with neat handwriting, daily notes, weather observations, wildlife sightings, and at the top of the first page, Ranger Thomas Halpern. Elliot blinked. He was living down here. Mark flipped through more pages. The entries were calm and thoughtful. Halpern had apparently discovered the strange radio behavior at the nearby tower in 1987. Fascinated by the phenomenon, he decided to remain in the forest studying it quietly. There was one final entry near the back of the notebook. Mark read it aloud. "If someone eventually finds these notes, please know I wasn't lost." Elena listened quietly. Mark continued reading. "I simply chose to stay here and study the strange signals. The forest is peaceful, and the work is interesting." Elliot looked around the small underground room. "So he never disappeared?" Elena nodded. "He just stepped away from the world." Mark closed the notebook gently. The mystery that had lasted nearly 40 years suddenly felt simple, quiet, understandable. They climbed back out of the shelter and stood beside the observation tower again. The forest around them swayed softly in the warm morning breeze. Elena looked up at the sky. A missing person case solved by a message from the future. Mark smiled. And by a ranger who simply wanted some quiet. Elliot laughed softly. "That I can understand." The three of them began walking back down the trail. Behind them, the old observation tower stood peacefully among the trees, and somewhere in the quiet radio equipment of Blackwood Forest, a calm conversation between investigators would continue echoing gently through time, not as a warning, not as a mystery, but as a small reminder that even the strangest events can unfold in the most peaceful way.